Hey there, Resume Leslie here. Thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to another lovely Wednesday in September. This month, I am talking to you all about resumes. It is International Update Your Resume Month, so I am talking to you all about resumes and just trying to get as much information as I can out into the hands of job seekers. So today I am going to answer 5 questions that are extremely common amongst struggling job seekers in the hopes that I can provide some transparency for you and help to make your job search a little bit easier by giving you some information, some insight, and some confidence for your resume. So with that said, let's go ahead and just dive into question number 1 today. Resume question number 1 that I see a lot and that I get a lot is, how long should my resume be? Sometimes this is a direct question that I get from someone or that I see out there on social media. Other times it is just clear from the resume that I received to review or from a potential client that that's a question that they haven't quite answered yet. Sometimes I get resumes where a whole career's worth of information is just crammed onto one page with text just edge to edge. Other times I get resumes that are 5, 6, 12, 13 pages long. So I want to come out and let you know a little bit more about the answer to that question. So the truth is that it differs from person to person, but that doesn't mean that it's just whatever you feel like is right to put on your resume. The length of the resume really should typically be no more than 2 pages. When I say typically, I can tell you that I've worked with over 600 clients in the last 5, almost 6 years, and the vast majority of clients that I've worked with have needed no more than 2 pages. With that said, there are some high-level executives or board members, or maybe even folks in high-level academics or the medical community who may need a 3-page resume or even a longer version of actually a CV as opposed to a resume. But for the vast majority of professionals that I've worked with and the vast majority of professionals out there, 2 pages is plenty. If you're a younger professional, if you're a student or a recent grad, or even if you're someone who is making a drastic change in your career, it's possible that 1 page will be plenty. So it's just about what relevant information you have that really needs to get in front of the right decision makers in order to let them know the value that you have. So as you are putting together your resume or as you're considering the length of your resume, the important part is to really go back through each piece of content and figure out, is this, number one, relevant enough in comparison to everything else on the page that it still needs to be there? And if it is, am I saying it concisely enough and really just getting straight down to the point of what the value is? And if you're not, then maybe try and go back and revamp your bullet point or your sentence or whatever it is that you're reconsidering, and try and figure out if there is a better, more concise way to put it. So the thing to remember about the length of your resume is really all about what is absolutely highly relevant to the types of positions you're pursuing. You certainly don't want to cut out important things for the sake of length, but you do want to try and keep things as concise as possible. And if you've listened to all this and you're thinking to yourself, I probably need 3 pages because my career is really important, you might absolutely be right. But I would encourage you to challenge that thought process and go back through your resume if it's 3 pages or more and figure out if everything's important. And if you can make anything more concise and try and get it to 2 pages. Because remember, recruiters are super busy and they get literally hundreds of resumes for a position sometimes. So you want to be as concise and bring your value in as concise a way as possible. So that's a little bit about the length of your resume. On a similar note, resume question number 2 is, how far back should an experienced person go? So this is a question that I see a lot. It's a question that kind of comes up just with general worries for job seekers. Oh, is the content on my resume what it should be? And am I going too far back? Am I going far back enough? So again, as is the case with most resume questions and with most sort of general rules for resumes, is it really just depends on what your situation is. But there are some trends and best practices that you can go by. So typically, the most important information from your career experience is going to be in the last 10 to 15 years or so. I say typically because that's not always the case. Of course, everyone's career history is different. What I want you to know, number one, is just because the last 10 years or the last 15 years are the most relevant and the most important, that doesn't mean that you want to just cut off everything else and start at 10 years ago, because especially for someone who has a more robust career than that, that can be, it can kind of cut you off at the knees as far as showing your effectiveness and your value if you're only showing the last 10 years. And it can also create a loss of context, really, for recruiters when they're reading through your resume. If you are presenting yourself as someone who has a lot of experience and then they only see 10 years on your resume, you're just leaving them to guess at what the years before that included. So my recommendation is typically the further back you go, the less detail you give. And of course, that's going to change if you had something further back in your career that was extremely important or highly relevant. So this is not a set in stone piece of advice, but for the most part, for the majority of professionals, it's just about giving the most detail on the most relevant stuff, which does tend to be more recent. And then the further back you go, you can give less detail. And even to the point where, for those of you who may have 20, 25, 30 years experience, it may be beneficial for you towards the very back end, or the very beginning, rather, of your career experience, to include it as an earlier career section, as opposed to really listing it in the same format as you would your more recent roles. And this allows you to sometimes take out the dates that you were there if you're worried about aging yourself a little bit, but still keep in the details of, the company name, if that was really important, or other details that happen to be relevant for that time at the beginning of your career. So how far back you should go really does, depend from person to person. But the general rule is 10 to 15 years. And I always recommend the more recent stuff, if it's more relevant, that's where you give the bulk of your detail and you really hit hard with your engaging, compelling content. And then as you go further back, that stuff's not going to typically be as relevant, so you can give less detail and less information. All right, moving on to question number 3, which is, should my resume only include experience that's relevant to the job I'm applying to? So this is really common for job seekers who are making a career change, or job seekers who are even sort of just shifting a little bit in direction in their careers. And that's happening a lot right now because of everything that's going on in the market and COVID and all of that. There's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of shifting and career changing going on. So I know I've talked a lot about relevance and how relevant information is really the most important thing that you want to think about. However, I don't want you to take that to mean if there's a job that you have in your background that's not super relevant, that you should just omit it entirely. especially if that's going to leave you with something that looks like a gap in your employment. You definitely don't want to do that. Again, it's about a context. You don't want to create a lack of context for that busy recruiter who's just, going through all those different resumes, trying to find the right people. You want to let them know everything they need to know. And if you look like you have a gap in employment, even when you didn't, that is going to raise some red flags, and it may take you out of the running. And instead of including that job, even if it's less relevant, and you can include it in just a more minimized way. You don't have to give that full detail. It's just like what I was saying with the jobs. The further back you go, it's pretty much anything that's less relevant. If you're including it in the resume, it's perfectly fine to kind of minimize the detail there so that it doesn't take up so much room, and to really draw attention to the more valuable, more detailed pieces of content in your resume. And on the subject of looking like or actually having a gap in your employment, another question, another big worry for job seekers is, how do I address a gap in my employment history? The first thing I want to note, and I actually had this conversation with a client yesterday or 2 days ago, and this client was worried that she had been unemployed for the majority of this year, and she was worried how that would look on her resume. And I want to be clear that I feel like this year especially is a little bit different. There's a little bit more leeway. So even though a gap in employment may get you a ding, or it may make you feel a little bit less confident, especially this year, it's a little bit more understandable than usual. So if that helps you just sort of breathe a little bit easier, I hope that it does. So let that worry sort of dissipate a little, and let's talk about what you do if you do have a gap in your employment history. So number one, if you can fill that space in your resume with anything substantial or of substance, that will be super helpful. So if you have done any volunteering, if you've been involved even with school stuff for your kids, or even with your alma mater that you graduated from, if you've done any involvement there, any community involvement, or even any training, even if it's unofficial, even if you've just gotten on the LinkedIn Learning or some other sort of online course or class that you can put in there, that can be a really valuable way to show that you weren't just resting back on your laurels, that you were being active and you were driving forward. If you don't have anything to put there, that's okay. There's only so much you can do, and I don't want that to stress you out too much. I want you to remember two things. Number one is that if you can build up the rest of your resume to be super compelling, to really sell what it is that you bring as far as value to an employer, how valuable your career history and skills and experience are everywhere else, then that gap in employment tends to be less important to the decision makers reading your resume. If every other piece of your resume is super engaging and they're like, man, this person's great, they seem like they really fit for this role and they can really help us accomplish our goals, then they'll be a lot more willing to overlook a gap in employment that may, in other situations for candidates who haven't proved their value as much, that gap in employment may stand in the way a little bit more. So one thing is to build up your resume as much as you can around that gap in employment so it's not as important. Another thing to remember is that networking is a great way to sort of sidestep any issues you might have around your resume at all, gaps in employment. I've also talked about networking when it comes to trying to avoid discrimination of any sort. The more person-to-person contact you can have, the more strong, mutually beneficial relationships you can have within your career space, the better off your chances are going to be able to overcome any potential issues from your background. So if there's someone out there who can refer you, or better yet, advocate for you in a company, in a role, that's going to help you sidestep some of those things like a gap in your employment history on your resume. All right, let's move on to question number 5, which is, how do I show results if I don't have hard numbers? So this month I've talked a lot about how quantifiable results are a really, really important and great way to set yourself apart and to elevate yourself above other candidates that may have similar experience. And that's absolutely true. If you can quantify with metrics, numbers, dollar signs, percentages, absolutely do so. But I don't want to skip over the value of qualifiable achievements. And I want to make sure that both of those ideas are out there. So if you don't have numbers that you can lend to your achievements, it may be other things that are really helpful to the company in other ways. So maybe you landed major clients or led major projects. Maybe you propelled successful turnarounds in the company. Things like that can all be really great ways to show your value and your potential and ability to bring about positive change and success. Some words, some terms that you can use instead of having those numbers or percentages. If you don't have those, you can utilize terms like substantial, drastic or dramatic, mission critical, industry leading. You can use qualifying terms to help to elevate the importance of and value of your achievements. So it doesn't have to be metrics, even though that can definitely be helpful. If it's not metrics, but if you have other achievements that you're proud of and you want to get out there, absolutely do, and really try to make those as compelling as possible with really strong qualifying language that goes along with it. All right, those are 5 super common resume questions that I get that I wanted to get out there and give you some information and provide some transparency for your job search. If you are looking for a little bit more help, I have a free 5-step resume action plan available. You can access that at my website, resumeleslie.com/resume-plan. So resumeleslie.com/resume-plan. It's right here on your screen. That's a 5-step action plan that will really take you through if you're struggling with what content to put on your resume and how to consider everything and what's the most important. This 5-step action plan will take you through in a step-by-step process exactly how to think about and compile your content for your resume. If you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the comments, send me a message, send me an email. I am always looking for more information that will help me help you, job seekers out there. I will be coming live at least weekly to answer questions like these and to provide more information. So if you've got a question that's just burning in your mind and you want it answered, drop it in the comments or send it to me directly. I am happy to help in any way I can. You guys have a great day, a great week. Best of luck in your job search, and I will talk to you soon.